All right, everybody, I'm going to get started. Got a lot of material to cover because it's big data. All right, so the presentation's called Big Data's Fourth V, Why We'll Never Find the Loch Ness Monster. But before I start, let me just ask, how many people believe there is a Loch Ness Monster? Small crowd. Anybody believe it does not exist? Firmly? Proof? All right, a little uncertainty. When I started to write this presentation, I thought it'd be really cool because it's a good example of big data. But as I was writing the presentation, I realized it's really hard actually to get any sort of straight answer on the thing. You can't. More volume? Okay. Oh, that's loud. Feedback. All right. So, yeah, when I wrote the presentation, I thought Loch Ness Monster would be really cool because there's a lot of data on it. But actually, as I looked into it more and more, I realized there's no conclusive answers. And so actually, this presentation is weird in the sense that I'm trying to focus on the vulnerabilities that are brought forward in big data situations, defining big data, but also focus on the vulnerabilities and the issues around it. And at the end of looking at some of these problems, you realize there may not be any hope. So that may be the problem here. But let me just get started. I'll introduce myself first because I know at B-Sides I've been asked to introduce myself before I talk. I like to do it the other way because I don't want to color your impression of me, but I'd like just to talk and then have you figure out for yourself who I am. But basically, this is my 18th year. I've done a bunch of B-Sides presentations, two notable ones. I did Las Vegas, where I did a Cloud Odyssey, and I did Stuxlove in 2010. Those were pretty fun to write, and they're on the web if you want to look them up. I'm a co-author of a new book called Securing the Virtual Environment, so if you want to check out anything about virtualization, that's sort of my specialty, or cloud. I have a few copies here, too, if you want to check them out. The book actually has a DVD in it with some attack scripts, and it shows you how to build an attack environment, how to attack virtualization, how to secure it. So it just came out last month, and it's from Wiley. It'll be at DEF CON if you want to buy copies. Flying Penguin is the name of my company. I started it 3 years ago full-time. I've been doing it for quite a while. But the idea is penguins actually do fly underwater. And so what I try to do in a lot of my presentations is take a contrarian view, show people things they might not have thought about before. Because a lot of people will say, they're birds, but they don't fly. And in fact, once they get underwater, they put their wings out and they fly just like birds in the air. So if you think about it from a scientific angle, you actually realize that they're one of the fastest birds on Earth when they fly. They don't swim, they actually fly. All right, so let me get right into it. I'm going to do an introduction, a little background on big data and why I'm interested in it. I'll do a part one where we talk about what it is. How many people here already have a definition of big data? Familiar, know what it is, work with it? Okay, so I'll spend a little bit of time on that because people are unfamiliar. Then I'll talk about what is really vulnerable and why vulnerability is so important in big data. And then I'll try to do some prescriptive stuff, talk about solutions or the future. And like I said, it may not be a pretty picture if you're looking at the Loch Ness Monster, but there are other areas that do have good solutions. Also, I think I want to mention that, one of the reasons I'm talking about this is because my virtualization presentation got rejected, which is my book. I'd really like to talk about that, but apparently this is more interesting to people. It got rejected at Black Hat, too. I'm actually happier to be speaking here. I like B-Sides. I'm a sponsor this year of B-Sides, so I actually contributed to the conference. But one of the things I have to mention is when they rejected it, they said back to me, like, virtualization, man, like, it's old. It's like, Zen's been zero-dayed so many times. You got to, like, really come up with something new and interesting, which I think is complete BS. I research virtualization exploits all the time. There are no, like, lists of 0 days on Zen, so I don't know what they smoke in Black Hat, but there's definitely like something else going on over there. And I think B-Sides really keeps it real. So this presentation is really about hard-learned experiences and some of the stuff that I've seen in the field, stuff going on today. I don't try to like sugarcoat it. I'm not trying to sell you on anything. So let's get right into it. So introduction. Why am I interested in big data? And maybe you are too. There are guys like this, Hal Varian at Google, who said, data is the future. Like, maybe you didn't think about it as the past that important, but in the future, the ability to be able to understand, process, and make meaningful results out of data, to visualize it, that's going to be a hugely important skill. And more you see ramp up of people who know Hadoop or people who know data science, that's their specialty. There are like tons of jobs and tons of companies that are looking at it. And as a security professional, whenever you see huge amounts of interest in a field, you got to figure there's lots of opportunity there for flaws, exploits, resources are exposed, because whenever people jump into something, they usually don't know that much about security. So big opportunities here for security. And that's sort of the beginning of it. But I'm also a big fan of Edward Tufte. How many people have heard of Edward? Yeah, he's a pretty popular guy. So he's got some cool stuff, and I had the chance to meet him recently, actually, because he has a museum he just opened in New York that was across the street from a conference, and I just walked into it, and I was like, oh my God, I didn't know. So he had just opened the museum, and he's standing there, and I started talking to him. And he's done some amazing stuff. Like, this is his chart of a Carl Sagan chart. He took basically a scatter plot, and you'd look at it and be like, okay, it's a bunch of dots. And he put in these animals, and you can see just by looking at it what's what. So you can see that this is brain mass on the left here and then body mass on the bottom. So as body mass and brain mass go up, you sort of see this like evolution chain. There's dinosaurs, there's birds, there's bats, stuff. So it has meaning, and you can deduce right from it like all sorts of stuff. I don't get some of it though. Like he's got babar. I don't really know how babar fits in. I don't know if that's tufty humor or what's going on, but I thought it was relevant because we're talking Hadoop, which is all about big data, elephants. And so does anybody know what this is? I don't know if you can see it in the back. It's pretty small. Does anybody know what a coelacanth is? Anybody heard of a coelacanth? Okay, cool. So I'll talk about that later. But these are some examples actually within here of, there's big data out there. There's a lot of analysis of that stuff going on. So, what have we learned from big data in the past, and people who are geniuses at charting it out and making meaningful charts of it like this. This is one of Tufte's most famous examples of the Napoleonic campaign. He did this Russian campaign. He started off with a massive army. He got to Moscow, and that turned him back, and by the time he got back here, this little tiny black line is the size of his army. So the devastation of his army, and by temperature, you can see on the bottom. So visualization's pretty awesome, but they've been doing it since, I forget, this is the 1800s. So, when Google's saying like the future is visualization of big data, it's like, well, they had lots of big data. So what's different about it? So I walk up to Tufte, I'm in the museum, and I say, I'm going to write a book about this. I'm really excited about big data security. What do you think, Mr. Tufte? And he says, big data doesn't exist. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, there's just data's data. There's tons of it everywhere. We work with it all the time. There's no big data. It's all crap. Marketing, blah, blah, blah. And he's super hard-nosed about what's what. And he also always says, look at the white space. That's his big thing, Don't look at what's on the space, but look at what's around it. The more white space you have, the more meaning, all this crazy stuff. He's a pretty cool guy. So with that in mind, I went back to the drawing board. I was like, uh-oh, what's big data? What is really different about big data? Whoops. So, has everyone heard of the 3 V's? Everybody familiar with 3 V's? All right, so Gartner said a long time ago, I think it was 2001, Gartner had a white paper or some publication that said there are 3 V's, the volume, the velocity, and the variety. And that's pretty early, so 2001. They just republished it like 2012. I have a link here in the bottom. But I tried to do a haiku. I just couldn't get it to work. But basically, it's many data points that grow very quickly, and they are fairly unique if you want to put it into a haiku. And the bottom line is, it's different now because the magnitude and the speed. When you think about the guy who's drawing that Napoleonic campaign, that was like in a library, or he collected it, but it was static information that he could gather over time. And what's really different now is the size of data is much larger, and the amount that's coming in is much faster. So I'll talk a lot about that. And it's coming in in fairly unique ways. So we're having a harder time of making sense of it or making meaning out of it. So that's why it becomes so important for people to be good at it. Right? So I also looked at why we're so fascinated at it, or by it. And last year I spoke about HAL in 2001 and 2011. I put a spin on it. But everyone's familiar with HAL and how he's a genius. But he also went off the rails, right? Here's a computer who's supposed to know everything, but he ends up killing the crew because he knows so much he considers them a threat. So obviously we have examples in our big data science fiction novels of big data gone wrong. Then we have 42. Everybody familiar with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? Put everything in the world into this computer, you ask it for the meaning of life, and it comes up with an answer. So we have a lot of examples of big data gone wrong. Anybody know who this is? All right, yeah, cool. Red Dwarf, Holly, one of my favorite shows of all time. And then, of course, we have Data himself, right? So we have a lot of examples of people who are really fascinated by big data in science fiction. We have a lot of examples that we have to differentiate from. Maybe one of the most famous is RoboCop, because it's all about data, right? Everything about him has like data points and analysis. It's a classic Asimov style, like you can learn so much. And I don't know if you saw recently, but there was a parody on this where this little screen pops up, right? The heads-up display. You've ever seen the Google glasses, but this is the old heads-up display. It pops up and it says, 68% bitch rating and out-of-style jeans, off-brand backpack, split ends, right? So it's the future of big data analysis. So we have a lot of good science fiction. But in reality, seriously speaking, a lot of disciplines are based on big data. So we have astronomy, Carl Sagan's favorite saying, we have billions and billions of stars and all that sort of stuff. Astronomy is looking for alien life or meaning in life, in plasma and so forth, dust in the space. Meteorology, they're always looking at storm patterns. I blog a lot about stuff like this, how they're reducing risk to ships by figuring out storms faster and figuring out wave patterns. It's like the science of waves is this huge mystery, and so much data on waves, and we still don't understand how they work or why they're so big and when rogue waves are going to hit you and kill you. So geology has earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, all that sort of stuff. Anatomy has disease, things we try to understand, or health, longevity. Economics has fraud. And then espionage, I wrote about recently. people have been telling me a lot about how the Chinese are spying on us, but I'm a big fan of studying, probably because of my background. I studied history and political science for a long time. But the United States was famous for its spying, and especially through the 80s on France, and it got caught a few times. And I posted something recently on my blog about how in the early 90s, the ex-director of the CIA just came out and said, yes, we spied on you, and you deserved it because you're a bunch of French bastards, and you bribe everybody and you don't play fair, so if we didn't spy on you, then it just wouldn't be right. We have to spy on you. So there's a lot of use of big data. Echelon was this huge, fields and fields and fields of supercomputers digging through everyone's data and trying to look for keywords to win in economics, basically. Proved that the economic system of America was better because it was free market, didn't need government interference, but of course, Echelon and spying is government interference, so you can see where that argument goes. All right, so what does it look like today? Like, to the average person, what this future is really coming to mean is, you can just sort of look down a suburban street and maybe put on your glasses like the RoboCop and be like, oh yeah, that guy's a felon, which you can do, right? You can look for child predators or convicted felons in your neighborhood. You can see someone who's 24 years old probably by looking at some dating site or something. You can see someone's lost weight or gained weight because they might be on a dating site. There's a lot of examples now of people recovering equipment from dating sites by setting up fake profiles and trying to find out who might be a profile that fit the person they saw when they stole something. Literally, yeah. In fact, there's a good case of where a laptop got stolen and they had some tracking information on it, and they were able to see that person signed on to a dating site and put the profile of what they looked like in the computer, so they saw this person was signing on as, a white male, 165 pounds with this, and then they told the police, this is the person that stole my computer, or at least has it right now. You can see someone might have bribed a politician. If you look at the voter registry, this has been actually a documented case. You can look at information like that and find out a lot about people. You can tell that they're on a trip, looking at Twitter, of course. You can tell that they're stealing MP3s. You can tell that they have guns. You can see that they're having a heart attack even. Sometimes there's information you can get. Or you can see that they're downloading or learning about RAT, right? So remote administration. I'll show you an example of that. But here's a real-world example that's kind of meaningful, I think. A lot of people thought this was cool in 2009. About the same time that guy was talking about big data at Google, they're also showing that Google's mapping queries on the flu trends and showing that you can see the swine flu epidemic before the CDC even talks about it. So you're looking at these, basically Google sitting there looking at what people are looking at, the flu trends, and telling CDC, hey, there might be a flu going on, you guys should get on that. So there's some really good examples of how that's being used. This is a little tongue-in-cheek, but I don't know if you saw this on Reddit. This was going around for a while. But this blew my mind, literally. So humans have trillions of cells. So if you really add it up, each human has 144 trillion gigabytes of data in them, right? So that's a lot of data. So if you think about health and big data and what the meaning of the new revolution in data collection means, there's a lot of data that can be collected and deciphered. And then the example on Reddit was that they did analysis of sperm because they figured out that by using a simple, I didn't do the math, I just took their math and copied it. So it could be wrong, but this is basically what they said. At 31 petabytes a second, that's the average speed of an ejaculation, which is, they said, 5 seconds. So Google only processes 20 petabytes a day, and we're talking 31 petabytes a second. So if you really want to study data, there's a lot, if you get into a lot of fields of study, there's a lot of big data. So again, it's volume, velocity, and variety. And if you really dig into it, that's what we're going to focus on a little bit here today. But I'm going to try to take it down to a practical level, not the theoretical or the scientific. Because for me, that's really the difference. It's not so much about systems that are out there like Echelon or supercomputers that are doing research that are funded by governments. It's about the average person and what you're going to do with this data. Can you do big data analysis at your company, and do you have risk that you need to address, right? So there's 7 billion people in the world, right? This is, again, is Google. They've sucked up all of the World Bank information that's coming in, and they've now presented it on the web. So you can go and you can, as a person, mine World Bank data, and you can chart it very easily. So 7 billion people in the world. It looks like the United States has about a 90% penetration if you look at mobile subscriptions. So that's pretty good, right? We're ahead of the world, which is averaging 80. So I'm like, woohoo, America, #1. But then I started looking at the data and realizing South Africa has 100% penetration. It's only 50 million people, but 100% of people in South Africa are using mobiles, right? That's pretty awesome. So in other words, if you're a security person and you want to figure out how to get at somebody, mobile's a really good way to do it in South Africa because everyone's got one. And everyone's collecting probably data about where they're moving, what they're doing, if they're doing Netflix reviews, mobile's a great way to get into this space. But then I started really getting crazy and looking at data, and I figured that, the United States is way down on the bottom. Anybody know where Vanuatu is? Anybody heard of Vanuatu? Yeah, an island. But where? South Pacific, yeah. So Vanuatu is about 200,000 people in the South Pacific. Look at that line. It is like literally like 2009, bam, everybody in the island has a phone. And so you can see some crazy stuff coming. If you wanted to figure out how to take over Vanuatu, this is what I used to study, right? Coups, military engagements. I don't know if you know about the Seychelles, but the reason the Seychelles coup failed was because these guys showed up with golf bags and they walked through the items to declare line by accident. It was all planned out. Everything was going to plan. Everything was great. They walked through the items to declare. They took the heads off of the, the golf bags have those little fuzzy things that sit on top of the golf. They pulled that off, and there's a 50 caliber machine gun in the bag. And then the big firefight broke out, and that was the end of the coup. They all got shot in the airport. And so anyway, these islands, if you wanted to take them over today, you probably wouldn't go through with your machine guns and the items to declare. You would probably attack mobile. You'd probably send people stuff through their mobile devices. You'd figure out the area code, and you'd be able to get it every single person potentially. Anyway, you can see Israel is slowly creeping up, so there might be a lot of old handsets. Compared to Libya, surprisingly, boom, they're right at. I mean, that's not the impression you get in the news, that everybody in Libya has a new phone that they bought in the past 2 years. And then Saudi Arabia is up there at 27 million at almost 200, right? 200 subscriptions. So for every 100 people, there's 2 phones, which is kind of interesting. Why would they have a second phone? So example of big data. But mobile itself isn't as interesting as what they're doing on it. So let's look at Twitter. So tweets per day, you can see this ramp up of the tweets going on. Unfortunately, with the Twitter data, a lot of that is people who either talk a lot or have automated the bot. And it's not really interesting data. So it's not like stuff that's for sure going to be useful to you. It might be some program that's running that's just tweeting a lot. But if you look at it from this example, you can see that there are growth areas in Africa. This is one of my favorite charts because it shows the tweets by area, the amount of tweets. So Egypt, for example, has 1.2 million tweets, potentially related to political action. But you can also see, you've got crazy amounts down here in Rwanda and so forth. Somalia is there. So if you really want to figure out where stuff's going on or how to access people, you can look at the data that's available to you from mobile. One of the things I talked about at RSA, I mentioned RAT before, but I started looking at where people were training on tools. So if you want to look at black hole RAT, which is an attack on Mac operating system, Cameroon and Uganda have a high incidence of attacks on black hole RAT. They're training on that tool. Also Australia and the United States. So you can see who's really accessing these videos, what they're doing. So this data about you is easily accessible and tells a lot about what you're doing. Another interesting example is we talk a lot in the United States about our volumes of data, but if you look at China Telecom and China Mobile, they have some crazy amounts of data that they're putting into their databases. So 1 billion texts in a day in February of 2011. Anybody know what 3rd of February 2011 was? Yeah, New Year. So on New Year's Day, what they did was actually everybody in China was saying, send to all of my friends, Happy New Year. And the system was like, boom, million tweets, and it was up 13%. So you can see, the rabbit was 2011, but you can see there's a lot of stuff going on that you can collect. And those people are collecting them. Telecom companies are collecting everything you say, right? There's even more requests for information than ever. Right, so the FBI is looking at your data that's going through those mobile systems. So in summary, just to get past the what is big data, we see there's a lot of volume, and we have more sources creating more output than ever before. The mobile phone is really the future, and everything you're doing on the mobile phone, somebody this morning was showing me how their mood is being recorded by their mobile phone, and I was like, you want to put that in your phone? Oh yeah, I'm like telling it I'm happy, and it's like telling me I'm taking a picture of myself, and then it's recording my mood with my photo to have like I was like, that's like a psychological experiment nightmare. Like, why do you want to do that to yourself? So people are putting all kinds of crazy information on these small devices. It's expected, right? We like to do stuff. We're curious people. And we're doing it at incredibly fast speeds, right? You're talking like, when you look at China, for example, you see the types of speeds that just seem inconceivable. So, and then we have lots of variety. So you get audio and video blobs, binary large objects. You get lots of identification of people and the relationships. So once you have friends, of course, and you connect to people and the people you talk to the most often, you have opinions, ratings, and reviews. I'll talk about one of the examples of how that actually caught people out. Because the time that they would review something and whether you could identify them as an actual name is important. So yeah, like if you say to somebody, hey, did you review this really obscure movie like Me and Tito? And they'll be like, yeah, that was a great movie. Yeah. You just go and look at who reviewed it, right? And you can see, now I know that's that person, that's what their opinion of it. It can be really dangerous. I do a lot of Yelp reviews, and I work really hard to make sure no one ever finds out who I am. right? The anonymous thing is huge, and it gets harder and harder every day. So configurations, of course, there's a huge amount of configuration data that's coming in, settings. If you're a hacker, you of course want to get into a system that's been misconfigured. So I have dummy systems up. I have Drupal sites up, for example, that people are constantly trying to log into. And I can constantly see people trying to get in because of how it's configured. So it keeps me apprised of when the next attack will come, and then logs, of course. But at the end of the day, it's about accessibility to that information, and it's about being commodified. Anybody know who came up with the word commodified? No? Karl Marx. So this is one of the old Marxist sayings, but he was basically talking about commodities. But his point was that stuff that doesn't have value gets value. And I think the future is really in the fact that more and more of us are going to have access to this data, and we're going to do stuff. Like you saw what I did with the Google charts. You could probably start doing that with mobile information, especially if you can figure out how to hack in and steal that mobile information. That might seem implausible until you start looking at some of the APIs that providers give you. And then stuff you can do, like that's the choice point breach, right? Some Nigerian dude in Los Angeles called up and said, I'm a business, and boom, he downloaded everybody's identity information. What he did with that, he could have been doing like marketing, he could have done, China just shut down this company because they said that it was a legit company collecting investment information. 150 million people they collected investment information on in China, and once they figured out that it was actually being used for illegal purposes, the Chinese government shut it down. You'd think that that would be like, yay, you know, awesome, you're protecting identity information, because that's the story we tell in America when people do that kind of shutdown. But instead, the American press, CNN in particular, said it's getting harder and harder to invest in China because they're shutting down our source of information about individuals, right? So it's not a black and white picture, right? A lot of times that information is useful to us, especially if you're an investor, to figure out whether someone's a legit business person. You look at their loans, you look at their history of income, you look at their tax returns, and that information is what you use as a bank. But if you're an individual investor trying to invest in a small company in China, you're now representing a microloan or something. You're like a bank, so you're going to start trying to hack in and get people's information. So that's the problem. It's more accessible than ever, and it's become commodified. It has real value to us. That's why it's big data now, whereas Tufte is saying it's just data. This is what big data is about. So I put it in terms like this. Data management tools used to be like this, right? Expensive and slow, but you could get the work done. If you had a horse and a plow, it was good enough. But there's so much data now, we need tools that's going to go out there and harvest this stuff like a combine. Just take it up really fast. So that's the next section. Why is stuff vulnerable, right? When you think about what the combine is going to be mowing down and what it's going to be accessing and how secure it is, a lot of scary stuff comes up. Because essentially you're talking data harvesting. Who do you want to have a data harvest tool? I could go on and on about pesticides, but I'll skip that. So the fourth V, vulnerability, is really the three Vs being done without CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So it's a little contrived, but I'll try to fit it in. Security terms don't always work, but I'm just going to try to use it for convenience because we all know those. But first, a quick quiz. Let's say that you're in charge of a database that has usernames, real names, date of birth, location, sex, that sort of information. And Pepsi comes along and says to you, we need all the birth dates, right? You've got the date of birth information. We want to give you $10 million to give us that date of birth information so that we can run a campaign on 13-year-olds who drink Pepsi. What would you give them? Where's my clock? Tick, tick. Contest? HR department? There is an answer. I mean, you can give them something, but what would you give them so that they can get what they need done? You can't give them the birthdays because you've given them the data, right? Now they have everybody's birthday, and what can they do with it? Log into their accounts and steal all sorts of stuff because that's their birthday. They're used for registration and password resets. Yes, summaries. So you do ranges. So you start to say to them, well, we can tell you how many people are between the ages of 13 and 18 or between 13 and 1 and stuff like that. And so they can get this many people have, or this address is associated in this age range. Like you're within the range that we're targeting, that sort of thing. So you begin, this is classic statistical analysis. I'll talk about that in detail later. But basically what you're trying to do is say, we don't want to give you any of this data. What do you want to get done? It's a classic role for the security person. What are you trying to do? Just tell me the thing you're doing and I'll tell you what you can do. Don't just tell me to give you the date of birth. So big data is even more problematic because there's so much data coming in so fast. Everybody's trying to get their hands in it because they can make so much money, and you have to sit there as the gatekeeper and say, how about I give you a range of dates? Would that work? All right, so let's move on to confidentiality. Here's a quick pop quiz. Anybody know why New York, Illinois, and Florida, even though they're in the top 5 most populated states, are way below on breach data? Like, I threw this graph together for some. Go ahead. Yeah, exactly. So the regulations don't exist that really force people to say that they've had problems. So confidentiality loss, breach data is all about confidentiality loss. And California is like huge, trending way up there. And they do that because they're super strict about the laws. We don't really have really good breach data laws across the board in all places. So when you think about confidentiality and you're looking at like where it's done best, it's pretty much a reflection of where people have regulated it. And so you can do some, it's my attempt to be like a cool chart person, but that was a quick 5-minute job. All right, so confidentiality. Some of the things that come up when we talk about confidentiality of big data is like deletion. Like you don't really know where the data is going or where it is. Can you ever get back and delete it, especially on large farms and clouds? Because these storage arrays, without getting too technical right away, I'll get to the technical stuff a little bit later, but the super technical problem is that once you set it out there, it's like classic problem of disk storage. You write it somewhere and then you decide to write it somewhere else. You just move your pointer, but you don't actually get rid of the stuff that you've written before. It's sitting out there somewhere in some disk array. And so it may actually still be there and somebody could potentially go get it. So this worries people. A lot of people stay up at night and then they go, could we write a deletion algorithm that could go, well, really only the storage vendor could do that, and that's not happening right now. The next thing is self-destruction. Okay, so if they're not going to write the tool, can we actually have the data kill itself? Right? So there are actually tools now being discussed, like Vanish out of Washington. They're talking about, this data sits out there for a little while, and then if you don't access it, it's gone. And you can't use it. You don't have the key anymore, so it's useless. Which brings up all sorts of other issues about, strength of encryption and can somebody reverse it, because wiping supposedly is irreversible. Encryption theoretically is reversible. All right, but aside from the technical stuff, there are all these statistical control methods. That pop quiz I gave you about Pepsi is really about these types of methods, right? You can do aggregation, so you can do age groups. You can do salts. We're familiar with those for passwords, but you can actually add a lot of noise into your stuff. So when people get it, it's got this secret salt in there that tells you that it's your data, and it actually makes other data look hard so they can't figure out how to get the other stuff out. It basically munges it, but you know what it is, so you can go back and do a one-way or something. You can do imitations and synthetic, so you only give them some representation of the data. You can replace the data, doing swapping with like data, so they don't actually know the true data, they only know what you've given them. You can do wiping and suppress certain aspects of data. If you're familiar with PCI, you're familiar with some of this stuff, because every time you go into a PCI environment, they say, like, what are you doing to get rid of your cardholder data? Well, this on big data is a massively larger problem, because you have so much more data to figure out the value of and to delete, destroy, get rid of. So with that in mind, there are all these studies you should look at that are really relevant to this. Like in 1999, I think she might be the most famous, but LaTanya Sweeney basically said that she could figure out almost 90% of the United States by just looking at zip, sex, and date of birth. So if she could get your zip code, your sex, and your date of birth, she'd be good. If you could figure out a way to obscure that, I think sex is the easiest to obscure, but if you could figure out a way to make that obscure, then she might actually drop down a little bit. So city, for example, if you can't get zip, you can get city, she drops down to about 50%, but still a huge number in terms of anonymity. People can find you really easily. And what she did basically was she took a cross-reference of a healthcare survey, I think some big data repository of healthcare information, and she mapped it to the Massachusetts voter registration database. And by doing that, she was able to prove this, and she was able to prove to the governor of Massachusetts that she knew exactly what his symptoms or what his cause was that was kept by the insurance company. So it was pretty shocking. 2006, also very famous, AOL Research came out and said, here's 20 million queries of 650,000 users, and they said it's totally anonymized, so we can release this amount of information because no one will ever track anyone back. And the New York Times went out and said, oh, here's Thelma Arnold. We figured her out right away because she wrote like the stuff about her like town. Well, you know how searches work, right? You type in something that's very easily identifiable as you. So, you type in your name, Thelma Arnold, and they go, well, that must be Thelma Arnold looking for herself. And then you type in, why do dogs pee on rugs? And well, that's Thelma. She has a dog that pees on a rug all the time. True story. She actually typed that in. So 2006, the Netflix prize, right? This was where these two guys, there was a prize set by Netflix. I forget exactly what the prize was for, but they released 100 million records, 500,000 users, pretty large. And what they figured out was that if you could get a title of a movie and a rating of the movie and the date that it was rated, you could get 99% identifiability on the people that used the database in Netflix. Right? So confidentiality kind of sucks in these systems. And the most latest one, the most recent one that I've noticed is like this Apple versus Bitdefender Klufel argument, where Apple's basically trying to pull the Klufel tool off of their site. You can't get it anymore, I guess. But they did a quick 60,000 app study, and they figured out that about 42% of the apps aren't encrypting network traffic. 41% of apps are accessing your actual location information without your knowledge. They don't tell you they do this. So the mobile thing I was talking about before with the penetration, if you want to release an app and have people download it, you can get a lot of information out of people. And so the point of that is, obviously, that there should be something done about this. And what's being done is Apple is removing the tool that tells you that you're vulnerable. So at the same time, there's 25 billion apps that are downloaded from Apple and 20 billion apps downloaded from Google. So the magnitude of this problem, they're studying 60,000 apps. There's probably a lot more data analysis that can be done on the confidentiality issue. But let me go ahead into integrity. Much more interesting in my opinion. Confidentiality is the classic security issue, privacy and stuff, but integrity of big data is even bigger and even more interesting. One of the biggest problems is, of course, that the data is just simply wrong. You get in your GPS, you drive through the desert, you end up in a dead road, you get stuck and you die. True story. If you talk to the park rangers now, they say, do not use your GPS if you go through the desert. If you drive through the Mojave, they will warn you, don't use your GPS, because it'll tell you there are roads where there are no roads anymore. It'll send you down paths that don't have, pavement, and you'll get stuck. So there are lots of examples in England of people driving to the river, driving off bridges, because it says, in fact, when I drove over the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, a lot of times it says turn left, right in the middle of the bridge, right? So there's serious integrity issues. But some other examples are the inner city blue milk issue, where they tested a lot of inner city kids, and they said, what color is milk? And they said blue. And they were like, oh, inner city kids are dumb. But then they realized that it's like this issue with context where they actually get cartons of blue milk. Like the milk cartons themselves are blue colored. And then they realized when you look inside, it looks blue. Like because the cartons are blue and also because it's like thin milk, skim milk and stuff like that. It has a sort of a blue tinge. So a lot of the data may actually be polluted by the way that you're setting it up, the way you're querying people. And then there's the old diaper issue where Arthur Little did a study, and he actually polluted the study by going in and, well, this was during the controversy of disposables versus cloth, and he was hired by a company that made disposables, and he went and proved that disposables are much safer for the environment because you use less water to make them and all that sort of stuff, the big picture argument. So he created a context that gave the argument a whole new meaning, and from that, really, that's why disposable diapers, I think, became so popular. One of the reasons was this landmark study that changed the context to change the meaning of all the data. But it really questions like whether the data was valid. Another example of diapers in terms of poisoning, I talked about this in New York, and people thought this was funny, but it basically was, people want to sell diapers, so they try to figure out a way to market diapers to a community, and then they try to figure out who's going to buy them. So they set out these market study areas, and then somebody went and just bought a ton of diapers. Like they went in that area and they just bought all the diapers to make sure that the study looked really good. And then they started like American shipment of diapers was totally based on this little market study, this extrapolation. Of course, nobody bought them. And so it was this huge mess to clean up. All right, didn't go over big here, but I thought that was funny. All right, so frozen Coke homework. Does anybody remember frozen Coke? Yeah? No? Nobody? Frozen Coke was huge. It was like the biggest, it was like the future of Coke, right? Well, that's the problem with the study there too. So they set up this thing where they would actually pay, it wasn't going so well when they were studying this region, so they paid kids to go to the big girls, big boys, whatever those places. They were like, if you come in and do your homework, we'll give you a voucher for frozen Coke. And so all these kids would come in and do homework, so they get free Whopper, free frozen Coke. It was basically like a Frosty. So all these kids started going and buying frozen Coke, tons of it. So they were going to launch this huge campaign, and then an auditor figured out that all the data had integrity issues. It was all fraud, and Coke wrote off like $9 million. And that's probably why you haven't heard of frozen Coke, because otherwise they would have shipped it to the entire country, and you would have been inundated with like, frozen Coke's the best. Look at this market data, right? Big data. And then there's also just flaws in the data that comes from like the Intel Pentium floating point unit error. You can get bad sampling. This is actually someone else's story, so I don't know if I want to tell too much of it. But in 2011, there was a huge rabbit flu scare in San Francisco that no one heard about. It was Fleet Week. All of the Navy was there, all of the brass, and one of the sensors tripped that said there was a rabbit flu. Anybody know what rabbit flu is? Yeah, I didn't know what it was either, but apparently it's like this obscure hunting thing where rabbits die and they get the flu and they die, and then if you kill an animal that ate the rabbit, you can get the flu, or if you work with a rabbit that's got it, you can get it. Doesn't seem like that big a deal. You get the flu, you get over it. But in the 50s, the United States did a lot of chemical warfare analysis of rabbit flu. They were going to drop it into countries and bomb people with rabbit flu. So when the government found out that there was a rabbit flu sensor trigger, they didn't think, oh yeah, somebody with a hunter or the situation might be tripped it or a dead rabbit. They thought, chemical warfare, weaponized rabbit flu. So they were like ready, literally moments away from shutting down the entire Bay Area. And then they discovered that someone's dog had like dragged a rabbit carcass out of the backyard into a closet, and that person wore a coat, and they got on the roof, and the sensor was next to their coat, and then bam, they were about to like go into DEFCON 5. All right, availability. So that's big issues with integrity. This is one of the problems with big data is there's so much to talk about, and there's so many issues with data and securing it. So I'm trying to get through this quickly so we can get to the really interesting technical stuff. But basically, the purpose of a lot of the big data systems is to have massively available amounts of data. You want huge amounts of storage and huge amounts of processing so you can work with it. And so you want simple, inexpensive, and fast, and also shared data. And examples of that are like your fraud department wants to look at what people have been doing. Your service reliability engineers need to look at what people are doing. Your QA department needs to look at what people are doing. So in a Google-like environment, everybody needs access. That's the shared part, which is usually left out of simple, inexpensive, and fast discussions, which is why security gets screwed in this equation, because people build stuff that's these three things, and they don't really talk about how shared it is, and they don't really design for shared access. So what happens is, in the simple, inexpensive, and fast world, if you remember RAID, of course, everybody's familiar with RAID. I just saw they do RAID 160. Anybody know what 160 is? It's crazy. Yeah, they do RAID 1, then they do RAID 6, then they do RAID 0 on top of it. It's awesome. It's like they just keep stacking them up. They call it the 3-layer cake or something. But you get to these massive levels of RAID, but people hate RAID, right? It's expensive now, and there's like, I worked with StorageWorks way, way, way back in the day. Not StorageWorks, it was, I forget, it was digital. I used to work with these original digital systems that had tons of disks. And so it was cool, but we would charge people a ton of money to run these systems. So they got into the distributed file systems, right? The Unix folks are always like, yeah, we don't need like tons of, and it's important to note that it was inexpensive disks when RAID first came out. It wasn't about, you know, security. It was really about getting massive amounts of storage for science. That's why they did a lot of RAID. But anyway, they moved to distributed file systems. Then there was this resource scavenging trend. Remember that SETI at home, where it was like, oh man, there's all these like free cycles out there. I'm going to get some of my own so I can do cool stuff and find aliens. So you put all this together and you see a trend in availability, right? People are trying to use resources that are available to get better availability of information to them. And so there, in about late 90s, you ended up with the Beowulf cluster. How many people have heard of or run a Beowulf cluster? All right, cool. Yeah, because that's kind of fallen off the radar. It doesn't really even exist anymore as a site. But at the time, it was really awesome because you're building a supercomputer out of old parts. And for schools and stuff that have tons of computers sitting around in labs, that's really awesome. You can basically scavenge hardware, and you can use it to create this massive NFS share with some RSH. Well, NFS and RSH not terribly secure. But even worse, in terms of availability, it had this master node issue where if you shut off the Beowulf master node, the whole thing was down. So you're zero availability. Doesn't matter if you're doing scientific research because you batch process. So you just start the batch again. And if you have a supercomputer, it's really fast. So it's like, oh, it took 10 minutes to process instead of 10 days. It died. I'll do it again. It'll take another 10 minutes. I'm still saving 9 days. So availability from a big data perspective has this bias implicitly built in. All right, so Google built something that was very similar to Beowulf in theory, and they had a single master with these large chunks of data doing batch operations. And here, too, you see the same problem. Their master node would go down, dead. Index was dead. They'd have to go back and build it again. But again, didn't really matter because they'd get to it eventually, and their index would be built. They'd use an old index. Remember how I used to say, like, please index my site, and it would take a while? Well, maybe they had a master node death, and it was taking longer than usual, but usually it was pretty fast. They replaced it with Colossus because they can do multiple masters. And the reason for getting speed up was because they started to do stuff like YouTube, and they started to do stuff where they changed their chunk size because they couldn't do big chunks anymore. So there are all these like usability drivers. So Google is improving their system so that they can have better usability for the users on the back end. Again, still no security except for, you know, this multiple master in terms of availability. They also index in real time and stuff, so it's pretty cool. But I thought this was really interesting. If you go back to 2003 and you look at the original paper that Google wrote, they don't really, this is proprietary. You don't have access to this. You can't run your own Google version of this, right? The GFS or whatever it's called. But they said in this paper, they exposed themselves a little bit and said, we treat component failures as the norm rather than the exception. And yet, they have this master failure problem. And then if you look later in the paper, it says, having a single master vastly simplifies our design. So think about yourself as a security professional arguing this case. Well, yeah, it simplifies it, but it goes down. So what if we spent this much and had more availability? Doesn't it weigh out? In the end, they actually did that. So let's look at Hadoop then. Hadoop is something you can actually use. And everybody talks about Hadoop all the time because it's like you can do cool Google stuff, but you can do it, right? That's my whole point, really, is now this big data is moving into your realm because you can run home right now and you can set up a Hadoop cluster and you can start going. You can start Hadooping. So the basic architecture here is very similar. You have this MapReduce, which is a fancy way of saying that you're going to give lots of little things to do out to lots of resources. And then those are going to be run on these little nodes. So stuff that you want done and things that are going to do it. But they had a name node issue since they based it off of Google that was very similar. So it could die, you lose your name node, you lose your whole thing. That actually has bitten a lot of companies. And I've seen more and more companies say, we didn't understand there was this big availability issue. Our Hadoop cluster is going down. We're trying to do real-time processing and like lots of data analysis. The data's coming in super fast. Why can't we do it super fast? So name node failure. So let's look at it a little closer. Basically, you have the name node that's trying to set up these tasks and on data nodes. And it does this map, which I talked about a little bit, and a reduce, which I talked about a little bit. So here you send your data, it gets mapped to all of your resources, and then once it does the processing in record time, like a supercomputer, it hands it off, and then you reduce it back so that you have a final answer. So that's how a lot of computers end up looking like one giant supercomputer. And you have a job tracker. Well, obviously you need availability here and you need redundancy, but what actually came to mind when I looked at this was the communication between these devices. Remember the shared part? You have lots of stuff working together. The shared part is where your vulnerabilities really get introduced. So you move through confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and you start to realize that if you're going to look at availability designs, which is what the systems are based on, you start to find risk around confidentiality and integrity. Because if that RPC read is not secure, well then anybody can read or modify or change. And so that's exactly what's been happening, is that you're seeing authentication by assertion only in the Hadoop clusters. You're seeing authorization that's single user, and the single user happens to be named Hadoop, so it's pretty hard to guess and get in there and change the data. Remember the diapers, remember the Coke, the frozen Coke? If you want your marketing company to be successful and really invest in stuff, you go in and you modify a Hadoop query, you're golden, right? You don't have to go hire kids anymore with coupons. You can just go and modify some data. And there's obviously money in that. And then there's accounting, right? With no authorization, you can't really figure out who did what because you have one user doing everything and really no authentication. So it's like your accounting system's toast. Well, Hadoop knew this, and so they started to get in trouble with some people, and they started to fix it. So it's cool. We're seeing a trend here. But basically, the ease of use led to a design that was for arbitrary code execution. You tell that to a security person, they're like, what? You're doing arbitrary code on every system in your entire Hadoop cluster? Like, yeah, it's really fast, it's inexpensive, it's easy, okay, but what are you doing on it? Oh yeah, we're doing like, health checks for people's, heart, making sure they're safe, doing some big data analysis on heart risk. So the authentication issues, there's no verification, that's what I just talked about. Oh, and tasks are not isolated. So people talk a lot about virtualization clusters and how you have co-tenancy and task issues. This is a major problem in these big data clusters, that a lot of times the tasks can stomp all over each other. You can create a malicious task and it can blow away the other tasks. And then you can create your own tasks that do different calculations. So there's a lot of really cool opportunity for hacking through the Hadoop clusters. Unfortunately, though, or fortunately, they're getting some idea of what to do, and it follows the classic trend of security. What you're seeing is they've built Kerberos RPC and strong authentication. So Kerberos is not my favorite form of key management, but it's at least a strategy where it does ticketing. So before you can actually go in and do something, you're going to get a ticket from the Kerberos server. It does some group resolution on the master nodes. So if the master node doesn't know who you are, it might not even do it, which is cool, because now you're getting access controls. And tasks are run as the users, not as some single user. So you can see the basic controls being brought in. And this came in February 2012. So the chance of somebody doing this, upgrading and using this, is marginal to slim right now. But it's a good future. It's definitely going in the right direction. And they're also putting resource controls, which on Linux would be your ulimit controls, and they're giving ACLs to jobs. But all that being said, I noticed that there's a threat assumption right in the document if you go and look at the Hadoop documentation. The threat assumptions are like, nobody's going to be on your network in between the communication. So there's nobody who's able to intercept communicate. No bastion hosts even. So if you get into a Hadoop environment and you think, okay, my Hadoop environment's really vulnerable, so I'm going to put a bastion host. I don't know if that's the right term anymore, but I'm going to put something in a jump box, or who knows what people call it anymore, but I'm going to put something there that you get on to get in so it's secure. Well, that box can actually do man in the middle, so it breaks the entire security model if you don't have really good control over how people are getting in that environment. It also assumes that nobody has root. Like, users never have root on those systems, because then you can do bad things. Just kind of goes without saying, but still they call it out. And then there's no control over packets. So if users have any control over packets in the environment, there's really no network level security in these big data environments. That's basically what they're saying. All right, so putting it all together. Basically, this is an example that I came up with by looking at the guy's blog who does a lot of Hadoop work. And super smart guy. And what he says is, I took this study that's about narcotics officers. And narcotics officers are looking for people who are dealing in drugs. So they've got a few users, and they go and look at the call logs. And the call logs tell them they're calling Bogota and they're calling San Diego. They live in Los Angeles. So the idea is, can you tell who's calling Bogota more often than the average person? Because that's going to tell me that they're a cocaine dealer, in theory. So it's the study that was written in 2005. So he takes their calculations, which is basically here. John calls Bogota, John calls other cities, other callers call Bogota, and then he runs a simple Hadoop query, and he pumps out 7.88 to see if there's a higher than average rate of calls. So going back to the beginning, big data is about all this rapid accumulation of data on mobiles. Hadoop is about taking that information and doing queries on it, and you can imagine right now who's doing this type of query, right? And you can do it too. So you can build a Hadoop cluster, and you can download all kinds of crazy data from people's mobiles, especially if you write an app that allows you access that no one's going to stop you from getting. So you get all their location data, build a Hadoop cluster. You can see the vulnerability angle on this. One thing that jumped out here was that the guy who wrote this really cool blog post about how to do it, he actually has the queries and tells you how to do it. He said, well, we couldn't do a lot of this because this is something only the NSA would know, but I would question that. I think I've shown you, it's pretty easy to get the kind of data you need about people's calling patterns or whereabouts or whatever you're looking for. You don't have to be the NSA anymore to get this kind of information out of companies, as the choice point breach showed and other breaches showed, right? You just have to impersonate the NSA. So what do we do, right? We're heading this trend. It looks kind of good, but it's also super scary. So let's go back to the kind of trite but useful CIA. I say encryption is going to change fundamentally. I'm already seeing it change. I'm getting calls all the time about key management, but I think this is definitely the time to get into key management strategies because it's going to be super useful in these massively shared environments of huge amounts of data. And so key management standards are lacking. We need people to work on key management standards. KMIP sucks. It's good, but it's not it works on storage level. It doesn't work on the level of application, like mobile application data that we need. We're looking at self-destruction strategies. You need more evidence and like that works. We're looking at decryption levels that are impossible because we can't do wipes, so we have to get to levels of encryption that really can't be reversed. And then we're looking at poison pills, so if you got the data, it would like do something to you. Like we could tell it was yours. It's like marked bills, ink blots, stuff like that. So can you put an attribute on data that would be only your unique attribute so you'd know when somebody stole it? For integrity, we can do configuration and access control. So better and better configuration tools like SCAP gives you a lot of information from NIST. It's a standards-based system. So you can go and do queries of systems to see if they're in a configuration standard that's secure in order to tell if somebody's able to get in and corrupt or pollute that data. Containers and segmentation is a big part of it too, where data that's in this segment is protected, but data that's over here can be messed with. So examples of that are new hypervisors that are coming out to allow you to run an instance and then you destroy it at the end. So the more hypervisors you can run and destroy, the easier it is to prove that you have integrity of data, because in that instance it was secure, and when you destroy it and then start it again, it's back to that original state. It has integrity. All right, so the last one's availability. I think more and more we're going to see peer-to-peer communication. I'm sort of disappointed that there's a cool new tool that came out that does encryption of mobile communication, but it calls to the server every time. It goes to them and does communication. And I'm like, I don't want to talk to you. If I want to talk to my friend securely, I don't want any relationship with you whatsoever. But anyway, for availability, I think there's going to be more and more of that peering structure, because when you think about that guy goes down, I can't talk securely anymore to my friends. I would much rather have 5 friends and I can peer traffic through them, which is like the Skype model, and a lot of people use that already. But I would look at more and more of that. A lot of information is going through peers as opposed through central, which makes it harder for people to get central databases of what's going on. But that also begs a trust framework and people impersonating. So from that, I go to the Loch Ness Monster. I knew it was going to be hard to bring into this equation, but basically, here we go again, confidentiality, integrity, availability. You've probably seen this picture. This is the original picture that showed up in 1934 that said there's a monster. Since that time, they've tried to prove over and over again that the monster exists. It's like they've taken in so much data using sonar most recently, but they use binoculars, they use radio signals, they use all kinds of crazy stuff, pictures. Every time they do it, in 2003 they said they really proved it didn't exist, but every time they do it, there's an integrity issue. And I'm like, really? Like they couldn't protect the data every time they do a test? It was really that hard? You would think there'd be so much on the line, they really want to prove it, but sure enough, it's like the Loch Ness Hadoop monster. This is literally a theory. It's one of the most compelling theories. There was a circus in town, and it like had an elephant, and it was swimming around with its trunk up, and they took a photo of it. But the one thing that makes this not compelling is that somebody said, if the circus really was doing that, why didn't they like reveal that it was them and just call the paper? And Another theory is that it was staged by someone who hated the paper and wanted to make the paper look bad, but no one ever called in and said, you're idiots. So a lot of the theories are hard to prove. But anyway, back to the point. In '87, they did this deep scan by this guy, Loran, pretty famous guy, I guess. He invented like sonar technology. So he goes out there and he uses his sonar and he says, there's something here we don't know, and there's something here that's larger than a fish. And I'm like, are you trying to sell Loran sonar systems? Or like, you don't know what's down there? Like, that makes your system sound bad, right? But it's like the Loch Ness Monster. People want to buy the technology to find the answer. So it's this weird thing that we're really bad at. And then this study in the 70s, this guy said, no one's sure how the original came to be altered. And no one's really sure how, like, he took all these photographs that supposedly proved that this head was in the water, but it strangely looked like someone had altered the photographs and no one could explain why. So when you really look at it, like, we're really, really bad at integrity in this issue. But we're really good at this, which is being creative and coming up with crazy answers about data. And that, I think, is a huge warning. A lot of the big data analysis we've done historically has been way off the scale in terms of creativity. In this case, there were guys who were doing gold mining in Gobi Desert. They were nomads. And when they would take the gold and sell it to other civilizations, this just came out, this book that talks about this, but they would go and sell this stuff and to the Greeks, for example, and talk about these amazing griffins. And the Greeks have griffins now. If you look at like Greek literature and history and you go and look at urns and stuff, there's griffins. And there are these wings and beaks. Well, this anthropologist went back and found that the Protoceratops left behind these bone structures that had these beaks and stuff. And so she was thinking, well, they just looked at these bones while they were digging for gold, because they'd show up as they're digging, and just go and talk it up. And that's why they have this relationship. So this whole idea of these like people out in the field doing data analysis with all this stuff and then telling stories and coming up with these crazy explanations and then believing it and then handing it off. That's the key. Other people believing it. You see there's a trust relationship there. You see there's an integrity of data issue there. So we're really good at making things bad, like making the data even worse than it should be. So the integrity of discovery is sort of like where I'm headed with this. Right? The coelacanth, which I mentioned at the very beginning, is this fish that people said they discovered in 1938. But in fact, I'm sort of personally familiar with it. This is a picture I took of a coelacanth in a museum. But this is a fish that was caught all the time by fishers. Like, they would catch it, they would pick it up and be like, oh, not another coelacanth. This thing's oily, it's disgusting, it's spiny, it's gross. So they'd throw it back. And they were doing this for a long, long time. Well, then some Western scientist shows up and he's like, wait a minute, this has been extinct for 60 million years. You've discovered the first, case of the coelacanth. And it became this huge international phenomenon. And by the 50s, they were being documented and talked about like this massive discovery. But in fact, it seemed like a lot of people already had this data. It was floating around. And there was sort of this question about, are we really, when we look at this data, are we really being honest about when we discover things and when we're finding answers? So I think it's another warning that we have to be careful. When people present data analysis, sometimes what they're doing is representing stuff that everybody already knows, just in a new and novel way. But they're not really helping us with answers. So that's basically it. Big data's fourth V. What the data is, why it's vulnerable in all the different ways, and then what we're going to do now. Thank you very much.